with me is Ed Kless, and you may have noticed on the schedule, originally Jaram Padmanabhan was going to be here too, and he was called away at the last moment, so he is not joining us. So Ed's going to handle this session, and we are talking about accounting firm transformation, but in a little bit different way than it would have been had it been all three of us. So we're really going to be talking about the transformation of accounting firms from compliance firms to advisory, consulting, how to help your clients in much deeper ways, firms. So with that, I'd like Ed to introduce himself, and then we'll dig in.
Well, sure, Gail. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. My name is Ed Kless, and I do work for Sage. I have the best job at Sage. There's lots of people who have higher profile stuff, including our CEO, Stephen Kelly, but I have the best job at Sage, and that is I get to work with our partners, whether they be accounting firms or people who resell our software, or even sometimes our customers. And what I do is I help them make their businesses better. I believe that entrepreneurs continue the work of creation, and I don't care if you're thinking about creation in terms of an explosion out of nothingness 13.7 billion years ago, or 6 days in a garden and 1 day of rest. It doesn't matter. But I think entrepreneurs continue that work, and what's really great is in my role I get to work with entrepreneurs every single day to help them do that. So it's a great gig. It's a great gig.
Excellent. Well, and a lot of our accounting members of our audience also get to work with entrepreneurs a lot.
Exactly.
And we're finding that suddenly there are a lot of tools available that help them work with entrepreneurs in a much more creative way than it used to be. We talked about some of this in the last session when we were talking about technology roles for accountants and how the traditional role of accounting is changing. We're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive in this session and talk about the types of consulting that accountants can do and are the types that accountants are doing. And I think if you want to just start us off a little bit with some information on how this is all done and why we're doing this.
Sure, and what I want to talk a little bit first about is this notion of the changing business model that's happening. First of all, I'd like to define a business model as just how does your firm or your organization create value for and then capture value from, in terms of its price, from its customers, right? Very simple definition, right? Not this long MBA convoluted stuff. How do you create value for and capture value from customers? And what I believe has really always been, it's almost not that the business model is changing, it's just that we're understanding it better. So for years, I think many firms, and this is not just accountants, but also lawyers, engineers, any kind of professional, thought that they were, the term was a PSF, professional service firm, right? And what they were trying to do is provide services to those folks. The reality is that wasn't true, right? What they were is they were really professional knowledge firms. What they had was knowledge. And what the customers were paying for was either access to or transfer of that knowledge. And I make a distinction between those two things, all right? They're either buying just temporary access to their brain, or they're buying permanent transference of that knowledge to them about a particular topic. And what I think is really neat about understanding that model, and of course this is where my work with the VeriSage Institute comes in too, is that you can't charge by the hour for that, in no way, right? Because it makes no sense to pay for knowledge transfer or access to knowledge on an hourly basis. It's like, as my co-host on the radio show says, it's like sticking a ruler into your turkey on Thanksgiving to see how done it is, right? It's the completely wrong measuring stick, right? So what this allows us to do with thinking about things in terms of a professional knowledge firm begins this transformation of the accounting firm in really 4 distinct areas. And I know we're going to talk about this consulting piece, but before that, just to set this up, it's a shift from a focus on revenue generation to profit. And by profit, I don't just mean the profit of the firm, although that's part of it, but also the profit of the customer. Meaning, in every transaction in a marketplace, the customer is supposed to effectively make money on that transaction as well, right? In fact, the word transaction means beyond the action, right? Beyond the action of exchange, there's something else going on. So when I bought this cup of coffee at Starbucks, I wanted the coffee more, right, than the $4 I paid for it. So I benefited in some way. Well, the same thing is true of any firm, right? They benefit, the customer benefits in some way different from the price that they paid. And I think that's what's been missing, is the focus has always been on revenue generation, which is internal, versus value creation and overall profit creation outside. The second transformation, and I'm not going to go big time into this because, as you know, I talk a lot about this, and I want to try to avoid this subject today. And that is the change in the pricing model, right? So from cost plus pricing, from billing by the hour, to instead we're going to bill based on the value, right? So we're going to create value, and then we're going to charge a price that's commensurate with that value.
Okay, so 9 minutes, we were kind of, there's sort of a backroom bet on how long it would take you to say value pricing.
Oh, there was? Okay. So, but here's the really cool part is I'm not going to talk about that. I just set that piece up. But it's the other two pieces that I really want to focus on in this consulting session, and that is one, which is the move from focusing on efficiency to focusing on effectiveness. Right? There's been this big call for focus on efficiency inside firms for years and years and years. I'm not anti-efficiency, but it's the wrong thing, right? It's the wrong thing to focus on. I don't want an efficient surgeon if I have a brain tumor, right? I want an effective one. And the same thing is true of my accountant. I don't want an efficient accountant. I want an effective one. But what billing by the hour does is focuses you on that efficiency. And as a result, what we see is a lot of the conversations about technology, as you were talking about earlier with your guests, are around how is it that we increase the efficiency inside the firm. Well, I talked to a firm about 6 weeks ago, and this guy said something I thought was extraordinarily profound. He said, Ed, we implement technology inside of our firm not to get more efficient, but so that we can have better, deeper, and richer conversations with our customers. In other words, all that stuff that happens in the background, the file transfers, all very important. Don't get me wrong. That technology is extraordinarily important. But they do it not so that they reduce costs, not so that they cut costs out of that, but so instead what they do can have better conversations with their customers. Hence what we'll talk about today, this notion of consulting, right? And then the third component of this new transformation is this shift from worrying about the people capacity, right? How many people do we have? To instead their knowledge as an individual and as a person. So how can we increase the knowledge overall of the firm and the individual? Because after all, that's what the customer is paying for. So anyway, that's where we're going with this.
All right, that sounds pretty great. All right, so do we want to tackle those one at a time, or how?
Yeah, we can go, and then what I'd like to do is maybe talk about this shift, this business model transformation, and really what it means to move from this compliance to consulting, right? Because the compliance work, absolutely, you can see where all of those things that I just talked about, efficiency, billing by the hour, the people that you have in the firm, those are all focuses of people who are doing compliance work. I get it, right? But if you're really doing consulting work, you've got to begin to shift to these other things, right? These other things. And part of that is learning about the art and practice of what it means to be a consultant. I started my career working for an accounting firm, having only taken 2 classes in accounting, right? Financial and managerial, debits by the door. And, but my work was with customers and systems, right? And I think what's important to know is that while I was doing that for years, I thought I billed myself as a consultant, but I didn't know consulting theory and practice until I began to do some reading and discover some really cool stuff. And the first of which I wanted to do a little bit of a dive on, and that is this notion of different types of questions that were asked. And this comes to me from a guy by the name of Peter Block. For those of you out there, if you want to interested in reading some of his work, Peter Block has written 6 or so books on consulting theory and practice. His one book is called "The Answer to How is Yes." I really love that title, right? The answer to how is yes. Like, how does that? What does that mean? And what he's saying is that look, most of the time there are only 6 questions that we talk about in business. Right?
Okay, and we're going to tell you those questions in just a minute.
Sounds good.
So we're going to take a very quick break to learn a little bit more about SAGE, and we're going to come back with your first CPE code, and then we'll find out what these questions are.
Outstanding.
Hi, we are back, and you should see on the bottom of your screen the very first CPE code for this session. So be sure to write that down and keep track of that. So if you need to get CPE credit for this session, you'll be able to do that. So Ed was talking to us about 6 questions. There are only 6 questions that people ask or should ask.
We talk about in business, right? We
Okay.
talk about these 6 questions in business on a fairly regular basis, and and Block has identified them. How do you do it? How much does it cost? How long is it going to take? How have other people done it successfully? How do you measure it? And how do you get those people to change?
Okay.
Right?
We need to go through those a little more slowly.
Well, I'll talk about them individually or a little bit in a second. But what I want to notice is, as I ran through them, notice the form of the question, a couple different things. Number one, the form how. We said they always start out with how. How do we? How do I? How much? Whatever. How is the first form. The second thing that's interesting is the use of the second person pronoun in it. Right? How do you do it? Right? Not how should I do it, but how do you do it? And in consulting, this is one of the things that you can look at, because it's a potential danger sign. When you are asked as a consultant, so how do you do it, Mr. Consultant? You're setting yourself up for someone to reject your answer. Think about it. Gail, how do you do this? And you tell me, we go through this process, blah, 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 blah. And I can just say to you, well, that's great, Gail, but that won't work here. You don't know my business. You don't know my customers. You don't know, right? So I can reject the answer, and it's through this use of this second person pronoun that allows that to happen. So you would think that language is that important. We have to be, as a consultant, you have to begin to listen for those little cues, to see where people are. And it's not that people are sitting around the table like Mr. Burns in The Simpsons. How can I ask this question in an evil way, right? They're not doing that. This is just all of us, because Block says these questions that we went through are our natural defense mechanisms against change, right? If we don't want something to change, what we do is we pepper the person who's proposing the change with these very practical questions that make you sound really smart in meetings, right? Oh yeah, how much is that going to take? How long is that going to take? How much is that going to cost, right? Notice, especially that how long is it, or how much is it going to cost one is really interesting, especially for accountants, and here's why. When a customer says that to the majority of accountants who bill by the hour, when they ask, how long is it going to take? I jumped ahead. How long is that going to take? When you ask that to an accountant, what do they typically respond with?
Their hourly rate.
Yeah, their price. Isn't that funny? So Gail, how long is this going to take? And you'll come back and say, well, it's about $400.
Yeah.
It's a non sequitur, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, what are we having for dinner tonight? Blue. Right? It doesn't make any sense. But because accountants and other professionals, by the way, are so conditioned around this notion of we charge by the hour, that when they're asked how long is something going to take, they immediately think that the person is asking them a question of effort. Most of the time, us normal human beings, non-accountants, when we ask that question, we're asking a question of duration, right? We want to know, can I have it this week, 2 weeks from now, or 6 weeks from now, right? And it really doesn't matter whether it's 2 hours at any point, as long as I can get it within that duration. And what's funny is that it's a great, we were talking about value before, it's a great example of the value is being being framed by the customer in terms of when can I have it, right? And unfortunately, the accountant is thinking of it in terms of the value is, well, how long is it going to take me? And they're oftentimes very disparate. Right? And so it's interesting that Block has identified these questions. And then he says, no, there's other better questions that we as consultants should be helping our customers ask. And I want to be very specific about this. You don't just respond to the person who's talking to you and say, no, that's the wrong question. You should be asking me that question, right? Because they're not going to take that very well, right? There's an art and a practice to shifting the question so that they begin to ask themselves, instead of themselves asking, let's say, how long is it going to take? The question really should be, what's the commitment they're willing to make to whatever it is, right? The question is not, how much is this going to cost me? The question is really, what is the value of it to me? That's the more important question. And that's what Block has identified in this great book, The Answer to How is Yes. that we have to get really great at helping the customer really transform in their own mind the questions that they're asking. It's cool stuff, and it's all around language.
Well, I think a lot of the questions they ask, too, are based on what they've seen as tradition in accounting firms and how they've been conditioned.
Yeah, it's a practical thing, especially if you're working as an accountant with people in accounting, whether they're controllers or CFOs or who have been previously in private practice, right? Because you are thinking in sync then. But what I think is interesting is this ability to do consulting, especially at the CEO level and higher, right? Is they don't always have an accounting background, right? So their thinking is going to be sometimes very different from you. I want to share with you this story because I just had the opportunity for it to come back into my brain recently. And Peter Drucker, his last speech was at a Forbes conference, right? They quite literally wheeled him out in a wheelchair. And he was kind of like slumped over like this. And the way this story is written in the article is that a lot of people in the audience thought that he had expired on the way out, right? So and this is a conference a CEO, CFO conference sponsored by Forbes. So Drucker snaps up his head, right? And he begins his speech by saying this in that very thick Austrian accent that he had. He said, "I am here to tell you one thing. And that is the person who knows the least about your organization is your CFO." Stunned silence in the room. And what he was getting at is that and this is 20 years ago, but at the time, all of the stuff from a technology perspective that we talk about today was but a blip on the radar, right? But we're still only coming to terms to grips with that. And he was right. The CFO did know the least because the CFO was totally focused on what happened yesterday, right? And now the systems that we're capable of doing are about trying to see into the future where we can, right? And providing that experience and knowledge. But we can only do that, and this is where Block comes back in, if we begin to ask ourselves different questions.
I think that makes sense. Well, I think the way the systems have evolved and have given us this opportunity to see the future is pretty fascinating because when all the accounting technology started, that really wasn't even on the table.
No.
It was just how can we do things faster or more accurately.
Right.
My Excel spreadsheet will always add the numbers right if I hit the right formula.
Sure.
And it wasn't even on our mind of how this would transform the profession.
Right, and here's some really cool stuff about this. Is I think what's happening too, we're starting to see emerge is all of the systems that came along previously. Very good systems that Sage had, Sage 100, 300, 500, all those, and all of even our competitive market space. For the longest time, they were based on this: how do we automate a paper-based system? Right? That was the framework, that was the metaphor. But now what we're seeing, and just in terms of Sage, in terms of the emergence of Sage Intacct and also Sage Live, is a different metaphor. And that is to say, well, what if we never had to automate a paper system? What can we do? What if the accounting system, and this is like Sage Live, is what if the accounting system was not the center of the universe, right? But instead, your CRM system was the center of the universe, which makes sense, right? Your customers are really the central focus. And we hang the accounting stuff on the outside around that. Now, this is a radical shift, especially for accountants to think about. One of our chief challenges at Sage, and also with Sage Intacct too, is oftentimes educating accountants on this notion of multi-dimensional chart of accounts, right? And that they get very uncomfortable, surprise, surprise, with the notion that, what do you mean it can exist in different places, right? It's either here or there. Well, no, but debits still equal credits. We're not changing that paradigm, but that is less important. We're just going to assume that, and accountants are like, I don't think we're just going to assume that.
Pretty skeptical.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's interesting. So that, again, is some of the things that change the questions, right? Last one I want to talk about on this question, then we can move on to some more consulting type stuff, is just the scariest question in Block's list is the one that comes last, where he talks about how have other people done this successfully. And that one scares me, because if you think about that, just the nature of asking that question, it precludes innovation, right? You can't innovate if the question you're asking is, how have other people done this already?
Right.
Right? So picture this conversation between Wilbur and Orville Wright, you know, of going from Dayton, Ohio down to Kitty Hawk. Wilbur, how have other people done this powered man flight thing successfully? Well, Orville, I did some research at the Dayton Library, and what I came up with is this guy Icarus. You know, he put the wax in the wings and crashed into the river, didn't work. You know, Leonardo da Vinci, the greatest human mind that's ever existed, designed no less than 4 flying machines. None of them get off the ground. Actually, one gets off the ground, the heliocopter, and if you like crashes itself. You're right, Wilbur, the hell with it, let's go back to the bicycle shop. Yeah. Right? Because you can't create. So that's the scariest question I think a business can ask itself. And if you think about it, what are the things, there's so many times when that is, because we call it today benchmarking, by the way. Right? Right?
Yeah.
It's karaokeism. It's karaoke capitalism, right? You're trying to be like Frank Sinatra, and you're not. You're never going to be Frank Sinatra or Elvis, right? Despite how many drinks you or the audience has, it's not going to happen. So the question that Block suggests is, what do we want to create together? That's the question that businesses need to focus on. If I could instill that in every accountant who's watching today, is to begin to ask yourself, what do you want to create in the future? That's really the question. And I think that's going to lead you to what this business transformation, right? It's going to lead you to our conversation about consulting. But it's really that question that has to be answered.
And do you ask that on 2 levels of what does the accountant want to create in the accountant's firm, and also how does the accountant want to help the client create whatever that client's dream is? Correct.
And the way that, and I call this a discovery. I don't know if that's the right word, but I made this discovery about 4 years ago. The overwhelming majority of strategic planning conversations begin with a variation on this question, and that is, how much revenue are we going to produce in the allotted period of time? 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, whatever that is. And that, if you look at balanced scorecard, that's what you look at. That's the first question you start off with, right? You say like, what's our projected revenue number? And then we need to have everything around that supports that. Well, if you ask that question first, the rest of the answers are where? Well, they're internal. You're looking at yourself, right? Because this is what we have to do. The discovery I made is that's the wrong question to start out a strategy meeting. The right question is, how much value are we going to create for customers 2 years from now, 5 years from now? And how are we going to do that? Because what that does is that focuses the entirety of the conversation outside the organization. You'll eventually get back to your marketing plans and all that stuff again, crucially important. But I think if you focus on the outside first, which is what your point was, right, to say, oh no, we're asking this of the customers or the clients themselves, right, that's a very important question to ask. So.
All right, and speaking of questions to ask, I do have a question here for you. In addition to Block's The Answer to How is Yes, what other resources do you recommend to learn how to ask better questions?
Oh, okay. Well, one for sure is a book called, the author's name is Warren Berger, not the Supreme Court Justice, a different guy. But the book is called A More Beautiful Question. And what I really like about that, it's actually based on an E.E. Cummings poem, that for every answer there is a more beautiful question, right? And what's cool about this book is it's the only book I've ever read that has an index of questions in the back.
Nice.
Yep.
Very nice.
Yeah, cool stuff. So that would be another great resource for asking great questions.
Okay, excellent. So we're going to take another really quick break. We have a message from Sage, and then we'll have a CPE code message for you, and then we'll be back with Ed Kless. Hi, we're back, and we have your second CPE code on the screen for you to write down and record and keep track of so that you can get CPE credit for this session if you so desire. Also, there was a tech question that came into our line here, so if you have any tech questions at all, they need to be sent to info@ensuringsuccess.com, and we can help you solve any problem you have. So info@ensuringsuccess.com for tech questions. So Ed, where did we leave off?
Well, we were talking about the Peter Block questions, and then that answer to How Is Yes book is a let's call it a later work of Peter Block. I think it was 2001 that book came out, but. He had his masterpiece was written, I think, originally and published in 1979 or 80, and it's called Flawless Consulting, right? Flawless Consulting. He's since updated it, I think, 2 times. Yes, there's edition 2 and 3. I have all 3. And it's
all
really,
the editions?
yeah, all 3 editions of the book. And the reason is it's fun to watch his thinking evolve. Mm-hmm. Right? So as you read from one edition to the other, he's changing his mind on certain things, which is great because that's a sign of intelligence to be able to change your mind on something, right? But one of the things that he posits in the original book is something I think is a really important difference, especially with the emergence of, the outsourced CFO type work that we're seeing that being one level of consulting, right? And that is that there's a difference between a consultant and what Block calls a surrogate manager. A surrogate manager would just be a line manager type stuff. And here's the difference. He says, look, a consultant is a person who has some influence over an individual group or organization, but has no authority to make a decision. Right? That's how he defines consulting. Whereas a surrogate manager is a person who acts on behalf of or in place of a manager. In other words, they have the authority to make a decision, right? And I think that is an important distinction for an accountant to make when they're having a conversation about what level are you looking for, right? Because pure consulting means you don't make any decisions, right? That you're just influencing. Now, what's neat about this is Block says, look, you can be a consultant if you're helping a friend pick out a new pair of shoes or a golf club, right? You're a consultant with your children, right? In some case, or adult children or teenage children, right? You have influence but no ability to make the decision on their behalf, right? So all of these things that are consulting skills are really life skills when you think about it. But he says the danger is in thinking that you're a consultant and you're really a surrogate manager because the level of authority and responsibility is different. And oftentimes people are brought in what they think is a consulting role, i.e., I'm not in charge of making decisions, right? But then they're, in a sense, they're asked with making decisions, and then what they do is because they think that's the right thing, they start making the decisions, right?
So you're saying that the client puts them in that position?
In that position. The client puts them in the position of making decisions, right? And if you're doing good consulting, what you have to recognize is it's that point in the relationship when you have to say, wait a minute, hold on a second. The nature of our relationship is now changing. We are now going from this consulting relationship where I'm just giving you advice and influence to a place where I'm now acting on your behalf, right? Now, first of all, from a pricing standpoint, which one would you got to price it differently, right? Because which one's the higher risk?
Oh, definitely the manager.
Yeah, the surrogate manager. You're in a much higher risk position, right? So that the pricing has to change. And of course, if you're billing by the hour, that usually doesn't, right? We're usually still $250 an hour or whatever, all right? But even more important is did they also give you not only the responsibility of the decision, but the proper authority, right? And I think that's where a lot of consulting engagements begin to break down is when those two things are out of proportion. And most often it's, look, I'm giving you the responsibility, but not the authority, right? And that's when you've got to check in and say, all right, if the nature of our relationship is changing, that's fine. But in addition to the price change, we also have to change that you're giving me this authority. And you're allowing me to make these decisions on your behalf, and you're going to be okay with them, not as if I were an employee, because it's still not quite that, but not if I'm just a consultant, right? And I think that's an important thing for people to, because you can't be both at the same time, right? Those two roles, as I described them, they're incompatible with one another in terms of logic.
Right.
You're either this or that.
So I think we're also moving into a point, though, where if this is the accountant who is doing the consulting and possibly moving into a role of surrogate manager, then you start crossing over the independence line. And
correct.
So,
which is why I think we're seeing a lot of firms are getting rid of audits. Right?
So that they can do
that they can do this consulting work because one, it's more lucrative. Two, it's more sticky, right? From a marketing standpoint.
And it's better received because nobody really likes the audits, right? So
and because it's compliance, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's compliance. So then, for the smaller firms out there who are not doing audits, though, I think the same thing is true from a tax side, right? So you have the compliance type work, which and this may sound harsh, but if all you're doing is basic tax returns for people as a full-on CPA, I think it's time to just say, why don't you just tell them to go to that green square person place? I won't say the name, right? Why don't you just go there, right? Because what we have and I love this phrase. This is one of Ron Baker's great inventions. Is this notion that we have far too many brain surgeons piercing ears, right? And there are far too many accountants with 20, 30, 40 years experience who are doing tax prep work. I'm not talking about the planning stuff, all right? I'm not talking about the real consulting, and how is it that we can minimize my tax burden and all of this stuff. That's cool, right? That's where we want to be. But far too many people with long time of experience are still doing this true compliance, ear-piercing stuff, and it makes no sense.
Right.
Right? And you can't make that model work.
Do you want to take a minute just to tell our audience who Ron Baker is, in case some of our people don't know?
Oh, sure. If you don't know who Ron Baker is is, first of all, a dear friend of mine, but he is also I'll plug the book now. He's also a co-host on my radio show with The Soul of Enterprise. He is the founder, grandfather, maybe, not even godfather, of the whole value pricing movement, and founder of the VeraSage Institute, and by far one of the smartest people I have ever met in my life. So he's just a really good guy, and if you're interested in taking a look at his work, it's CPAPracticeAdvisor.com, and also The Soul of Enterprise, where we do our radio show. So thanks for the ability to plug. I appreciate that. But.
All right, we have a couple questions here, too.
Good. I love questions.
Let's see. How much value will we create for customers? What metrics are key for measuring value?
So this is a really good question and requires another hour, so I'm going to have to take over for the next session. No, and there's two separate questions there. The metric on the value, let me give you a simple one that I really like, and it's a play off of the question that I talked about earlier. So if the starting point for strategy is how much value are we going to create for our customers 3 months from now, 6 months, or 3 years from now, 5 years from now, whatever that is. Once we start to drill down, the question then becomes, how much value are we going to create for this customer? And what I would suggest that you do is pick out some of your customers and try to plot it out. We call this the value gap, and see what have you charged them now from a revenue standpoint? What value did you create for them? Because that's different, right? Here's the revenue. The value you created for them should be higher, right? And then ask, well, how much value can we create for them in the future? That customer, very specific, that customer, and go through that exercise of that creation. So that's the metric on value creation, is trying to extract and project what that would be in the future. In terms of getting to value, that's another skill, and it's a consulting skill too. In fact, it kind of leverages off some of the questions, because one of the questions was asked is, how much is this going to cost? And I said, well, really what you want them to get them to ask is, well, what's the value of this to me? Right. And I'll point another book at people, and that is Mahan Khalsa's book called Let's Get Real or Let's Not Play. And it's just a fantastic book, but to just give it the Reader's Digest extremely condensed version treatment, what he suggests is what we have to get good at doing, and this is what's really hard, is moving off the solution. right? All of us, myself included, by the way, as a professional, we are solutionists, right? In that what we really like to do is provide our solution. So when we are asked a question by a prospective customer about a solution, we want to talk about the solution because it makes us feel good, right? We're good at it. We've been doing it for a long time. Says, but Khalsa says the problem is that, see, solutions in and of themselves have zero value. They only derive their value from the problems that they solve. So what we have to get good at as professionals is having a conversation where we move off the solution, right? And it usually starts by just asking a very simple clarifying question, right? So the prospective customer, and I'll get to customer in just a second why I keep using that term that's falling harshly on many of your ears, but when the customer asks for something, what we need to do is we need to then begin to say, okay, let's ask a clarifying question about what they're asking for, right? And it sounds a little bit like this. I'm going to use a technology example because that's my background.
Okay.
Right. I need a report. How does your system do a report that shows me inventory turns by item category? Okay. Back in the day, I would solve that problem. I would like do the demo. I would bring up crystal reports and make it happen.
Right.
Right. Here, that's how it does it. Right. Well, what I learned from Khalsa is no. Here's what you do. You move off the solution. Thanks for asking. We do custom reports like that all the time. However, what we found is that oftentimes people don't need a customization to get information out of the system. There are other ways of getting that information out. They don't need a customization. Is that true, by the way? Yeah, it is true, right? So then this is the last part of it. So would it be okay if I asked you a couple of questions as to why you think you need this specific customization? And what are 99% of people going to respond to that?
They don't even know, or it's going to end up being exactly what the already existing product will do.
But they'll say, would it be okay if I ask you a couple questions? They'll say, sure.
Well, sure,
yeah, that's fine. And now what you've done is you've pivoted, or you've moved off the solution. You're now talking about the problem, right? You're not talking about the solution anymore. We're talking about the problem. And now, this is, if you read the rest of Khalsa's book, he then tells you, there's now a line of questioning that you can take to then get to the value from there, right? Because once we're talking about that problem, yep, we can probably get to something that's important from a value perspective, right? And that's really the trick. But the first person you've got to convince, is yourself that you got to do this, because you've got to break your habit of going to that solution. I like to, when I often talk about this, I have a whole session on this. My first line is, hi, my name is Ed, and I'm a recovering solutionist, right? Because we're all there. We're all there. So anyway, so that's the value question piece in very short form. Okay.
And you were going to talk about customers versus...
Oh, customer versus client. Yeah, this is a really interesting story. My dad, he's since passed away, but my dad taught Latin. I don't know if you know this, Gail, but and it was really interesting because do you ever see the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding?
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, there's the guy who the father, every time he's like, give me a word and I'll tell you why the origin is Greek, and they keep throwing stuff at him and he tries to go through this convoluted thing. It was sort of like that in my house growing up, but with Latin, like my dad was. And one of the words is a good one is mortgage. Right? Mortgage is a concatenation of two Latin words, mort, which means, you know this, right? Death, right? And gage, which means pledge, right? A mortgage is a death pledge. Makes total sense now, right? Yeah. I was like, I get it. All right. But the word client, it means one who leans. One who leans, right? Incline, decline, same root. The lawyers in ancient Rome had to perform services for their clients. They couldn't charge for them, right? So they fixed the people who were leaning. They had too much at the Machiavellian festival and had to be fixed. The original use of the term still exists today in social work, right? Social workers have clients. It's kind of a great unwashed connotation. The word customer comes from an English word meaning one whose custom it is. And that's why for the future relationships that accountants have, it's about the future. You want people, one whose customer it is to engage with you, not people you've got to fix every year by bringing the shoebox in.
Very good. Okay, I like that. All right, we're going to do one more quick break. a very brief message from Sage, and then we'll be back with your final CPE code for this session, so don't go away. Welcome back to Ensuring Success. This is the third CPE code for this session appearing on your screen right now, so be sure to write it down if you would like to claim CPE credit for this session. Remember, you can contact us at info@ensuringsuccess.com if you have any questions for Ed or any issues that you want to discuss with our tech team or anything. We're fielding all questions. So let's move ahead. Ed has something new to share with us.
Yeah. One of the questions that I'm often asked about, especially, well, it's pretty universal, CPAs, lawyers who I work with, is about scoping complex engagements, right? Where someone comes to them and typically the way it's phrased is, they don't know what they want, right? They really don't know what they want.
Mm-hmm. The client, the customer.
Right, the client, customer. They don't know what they want. And what's funny about that is that far too many professionals answer it using what I call that French thing. Right, here's the French thing. How should I know what this is going to cost me? Right? They don't do that, yeah. but that's what they say. Like I don't know. I want you to think about that. If you're being wheeled into surgery, the last thing you want to hear from the surgeon is, "Whew, never seen that before."
Yeah.
Right? You don't want to hear that. And far too many professionals, when they're asked about a complex problem, effectively give that response. Like, this is really tough, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, there's a guy by the name of Chris Marsden, who is also a fellow at the VeraSage Institute, who developed what he calls his concentric circles of scope. And he's a lawyer out of Boston, does all commercial litigation, 100% fixed price commercial litigation, okay? And the way that he does this is when people come to him, they're usually being sued. He's mostly on the defense side, but oftentimes it goes both ways, but mostly he's defending someone. Is they come to him and they're being sued, right? So if he did that French thing, it's not going to instill much confidence in them, right? But instead what he does is he sits them down in his conference room and he goes up to the whiteboard and he draws a circle, one little circle, and he writes yes in it. And he says, look, this is the yes work. This is what I know I have to do based on what I already know. Because he does know something, right? He knows that he probably has the brief, right, that's been filed. He knows who the judge is, because sometimes it's already been assigned to a particular part. He knows who the other attorney is, right? So whether the guy's reasonable or not, or gal is reasonable. So he knows something. He doesn't know how this case is going to play out, but he knows something. Right. And that's usually the case for accounting professionals. They know something. Do they know how it's going to work itself out? No, but they know something. They know the first couple of steps that they got to do. So he draws the circle and says, yes, this is what I absolutely know that I have to do, right? And he'll list that out. Then he draws another circle around that first circle. And he says, here's what's likely. And he usually says this is 50% chance or more of happening, right? Don't know. It's not going to definitely happen, but 50% more that's going to happen. And he begins to sketch out maybe a couple of different scenarios, like, oh, all right, I'm going to have to depose 3 witnesses. I'm going to have to file a cross motion or something like that that might be in the yes work, but he's going to give some different scenarios of what is likely to happen, right? Then the next circle he draws is what he calls the maybe. And this is the stuff that's 50% or less. Actually going to trial. As we know, most of the time, stuff is usually settled. But if it does go to trial, here's the stuff that we can expect, right? And then again, he's leveraging off of those different things that he has, the scenarios that he's played out. So those are the three, and I'm just going to stop there, and I'm going to talk about a fourth one in a second. But you see what he's doing there? A couple different things. Number one, he's potentially scoping out the engagement, right? He's creating 3 levels of opportunity, which if you have seen anything that we do on price theory, one of the things we're always talking about is offer your customer 3 choices, right? So he's creating that. But he's also doing one other thing that is the most important part. And it's very subtle. And most people, when I ask these about what he's doing, they get the first 2, but they don't get the third. And the third thing that he's doing is that he is demonstrating his expertise in a non-braggadocious way. Because whoever's sitting in his conference room chair is looking up at him after he's drawn these 3 concentric circles and saying, this guy's done this before, right?
Right.
And he didn't have to brag about his Harvard degree, which he had, he didn't have to brag about all of the case. He just laid out the possible scenarios all the way on up, right? And I think every professional is capable of this, right? You've got a tax problem with the IRS, or the customer has a tax problem with the IRS. You know what's BS work that you got to do. You know what's probably likely, and you know what the maybe stuff is. And if you can sketch that out for the customer and then present to them the different choices or options from a pricing perspective, you're much better off. Okay, so that's the heart of it. But there's one other thing which I think is pretty cool. He then occasionally draws one more circle, a 4th circle, which he calls WHK, which stands for who the hell knows, right? And this is precedent-setting case, goes all the way up to the US Supreme Court. Now, when I say he doesn't always draw it, there's a reason. He might have 2 or 3 matters in his portfolio of customers that are already WHK cases, in which case he doesn't draw the circle because he doesn't want to put his firm in a position of having a 3rd WHK case going on at the same time, right? So now that the person sitting there doesn't know, that doesn't exist, right? But he selectively does this. And what this is a great lesson in, and what Chris is a master at, is understanding that what he has is not his customer list isn't just how can I maximize revenue from all of them. He views them as a portfolio of risk, just like you would view your portfolio of stocks in your 401k, right? Is that you should have a certain amount of low-risk customers. You should have a certain amount of medium-risk customers, and then a smaller amount of these higher-risk customers, right? And keep them in your portfolio, and don't take on too much of any of one or the other. And I think that's the mistake, getting back to the brain surgeon's piercing ears, is far too many accountants are willing to take on this extraordinarily low-risk stuff, but then they say, well, I wonder why we're not expanding. I wonder why we're not being more profitable. It's because you're not taking on any of the risk. And if you're only comfortable there, then that's where you stay. But you then also can't complain.
Right. Right.
Right. So it's one or the other. So really interesting. Marsden Circles. This is a really great consulting tool.
Marston. M-A-R-S-T-O-N.
T-O-N. Yep.
Okay.
Exemplar Law, if you want to look them up. So,
cool.
Good stuff.
Very cool.
Yep.
All right. So we're winding down here. Is there anything else you would like to share with our audience regarding this transformation?
I would just definitely, when you're making this transformation inside the firm, one thing I would say is don't worry about it. It's going to take some time, right? It's all about taking smaller and smaller steps. There's a terrific video that I would recommend people who are beginning down this transformation journey to view, and that is, it's called The Backward Bicycle. The Backward Bicycle, and it's one of the guys who's in the video. I think he works for Jet Propulsion Laboratory in NASA, right? And this guy that he works with, a welder, challenged him to ride a backward bicycle. What's a backward bicycle? He put a gear in it so that when you turn the handlebars to the left, the wheel goes to the right, right? And he challenges this guy who's an engineer to ride it. And he says, this is going to be easy. So he jumps up, because he says, I know. I know. You turn left, the wheel's going to go right. I know, right? Well, surprise, surprise, he can't ride the bicycle. Can't do it, right? So important insight there. Knowledge does not equal understanding. Okay? Knowledge does not equal understanding. It takes him 8 months to learn how to ride this bicycle. Wow. And he tries it for 5 minutes every day. In his driveway, he crashes a lot, but it takes him 5 minutes to learn how to do this. and he finally learns how to ride the bicycle. Here's the real, and you're like, okay, I guess the thing's over, right? He can't ride a regular bike. He gets on a regular bike and can't do it. Why? Because the neural paths in his brain had carved this new way of thinking, right, in his brain. He also has his kid do this experiment. The kid learns how to ride the backward bicycle in 2 weeks. And what this is a demonstration of is the challenge is for all of us is that as adults, the neuroplasticity that we have in our brain is much, much smaller than those of young people. So here's the little tip. Put young people in charge of the transformation and let them do it, right? You're like, whoa. No, because their brains are more elastic, more plastic, and new ideas can come into them. As we age, we can't help it. Our brains begin to get solid, and we can't. It's much more difficult for that.
Right.
So it's going to take a long time to make this transformation. 8 months sounds about right, minimum.
Yeah.
Right. But so that's what you've got to do is be aware that this is a journey and not something that happens overnight.
Very cool. Excellent.
All right.
Ed, thank you very much.
Great. My
session.
pleasure. Yeah. Thanks, Gail.
Thank you all very much for attending this session. We will see you back at the top of the hour. Our next session coming up is productivity apps we love. You will not want to miss that. So we'll see you then.
Check and Balance Firm is mainly a tax preparation and accounting firm that specializes in small business clients. I try to keep my clients happy by just making sure that they can trust me in everything that I do and every decision that we make together. I just love helping people and making sure their finances are straight. I became an accountant because of my dad. He is my mentor. He'd been doing it before I was even born. So that was what pushed me to move toward accounting. We have our own separate businesses, and then we collaborate with each other. He contracts me out to do his accounting work and payroll for a lot of his business clients. The benefits of working with your family is you'll pretty much always have a job. We used to have our business in the basement of our home when I was growing up, and I used to just act like I was his receptionist, and he used to be like, this child. Me and my dad go to lunch together every day. We do a brain dump and just go through different things that we need to talk about. I feel like that's the best part of my day because I really get a lot of thinking done. When I was introduced to Sage 1, I decided this may be a good fit for me. I just started using Sage 1 Accountant Edition this year, and I was able to implement it with other programs that I needed. It's definitely been a great asset to my company. I try to do the bank feeds for my clients so that way I'll already have the information being uploaded into the system, and then I'm able to go in and do the accounting work. Right now, I'm paying for my clients' access. What I do on the back end is I just build them inside their accounting agreement with me. I love the fact that Sage does offer the cloud version and the desktop version, so it just gives me that flexibility. The mobile access is helping me because a lot of my clients can't get to my office to meet face-to-face. So usually what I do is take my iPad with me. Sage is going to help me streamline my workload. I can get to where I need to be, and then I'll be able to take on more business. I think it's the best decision I ever made by switching over to Sage 1. And I feel like they are going to definitely lead me in the right direction to get my company where it needs to be. Sage, where business gets personal.